Wyoming Territory, July 1878. The sun was barely up when 19-year-old Noelle Zeller kicked the stirrups free of the stolen bay mare and dropped to the dry earth just outside Cheyenne. Dust clung to her boots, her hands were scraped raw, and her lips were cracked from wind and fear. But she was free. For the first time in her life, she was free. Her father, Royce Zeller, had been hanged in Kansas 2 weeks before, wanted in 5 states, gunslinger, thief, and killer. She had not mourned him. She had run. Noelle yanked the saddlebag off the horse and ducked into the cottonwoods by the creek. She knelt, splashed cold water over her face, and stared at her reflection. The bruises along her jaw were fading, but the fear in her eyes was still fresh. She had lived under her father's shadow too long, and now every lawman west of the Mississippi wanted a word with the outlaw's daughter. She needed to disappear. Back in Kansas, she had overheard a plan Royce had been trying to force her into marrying one of his men, a drunk named Hoyt, in exchange for loyalty. That was when she had grabbed the gelding and gone. Now alone, hunted, and with nothing but a stolen pistol and $20 in her boot, Noelle had no plan, just a direction. West. She had only gone a mile down the trail when the mare stumbled, favoring its front leg. Noelle cursed under her breath and jumped down. "Easy," she whispered, running a hand down the animal's shoulder. The leg was swollen. The horse would not carry her far. She glanced up at the sky, then toward the open land stretching out into the horizon. She could walk. She had done worse. But just as she started to gather the reins, a voice called out behind her. "You planning to run that horse to death, or are you just lost?" Noelle spun around, hand on the pistol at her hip. A man sat atop a chestnut stallion maybe 10 yards away. Tall, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, with a steady look in his dark eyes. He wore a trail coat dusted from travel, and a rifle rested easy in the saddle's scabbard. He looked young but not green. Maybe 24, 25. His horse was calm under him, which meant he was, too. "I am not lost," she said, her voice sharp. He raised one brow. "Then maybe you are just stubborn." Noelle narrowed her eyes. "What do you want?" "Just noticed your horse limping. Thought you might need help," he said simply, then dipped his head. "Elias Sutton, I run cattle north of here." "Got a place 2 hours west." She did not answer. Her grip on the pistol never loosened. "You got a name?" he asked. "No," he chuckled, not unkindly. "Fair enough." Elias slid off his horse and stepped closer, slow and careful. "Mind if I take a look at your horse?" Her jaw tightened. "If you try anything, I will not," he said evenly. She let him near. He crouched by the mare, touched the leg gently. "Stone bruise," he said after a few seconds. "She needs rest. A few days, maybe more. She is no good to ride now." Noelle looked away, her throat tightening. "I do not have a few days." Elias stood and looked at her for a long moment. "You running from someone?" She said nothing. "My place is quiet, remote. No one comes by unless I ask them to. You can stay there, rest the horse, then go." "I don't need you do," he said, not unkindly. "And I got 2 little ones back home who would give you hell if I left someone in trouble out on the trail." Her eyes flicked up to his, uncertain. "You have children?" He nodded. "Not mine by blood. Their ma was my cousin. She died in the winter. Been looking after them since." She hesitated. "Why help me?" "Because someone helped me once," Elias said. "And because you look like you have not had many people willing to do the same." Noelle looked down at her boots. Her legs ached, her head pounded. She had nowhere else to go. "Fine," she muttered. "Fine," Elias echoed, his voice soft. He helped her lift the saddle off the bay and tied the mare's reins to his own saddle horn. Noelle climbed up behind him, tense and stiff, but he kept his hands respectful, his voice quiet. They rode west, the prairie stretching wide around them, the wind tugging at her hair like a child begging for attention. By the time they reached the small ranch tucked into a low valley, with its weathered barn and one-room cabin, dusk had painted the sky gold and pink. A boy with sandy hair and a girl with dark braids ran out from the porch. "Elias," the girl shouted. "You are late," "Had company," Elias called back. The children skidded to a stop when they saw Noelle. "This is Noelle," he said, glancing back at her. "She is staying a few days." The boy looked curious, the girl suspicious. "I am Sadie," the girl said, arms crossed. "I am Silas," the boy said, grinning. Noelle blinked. She had not heard a child laugh in years. Elias swung down and helped her off. "We will get you settled. The spare cot is inside. We will figure the rest out tomorrow." Inside, the cabin was small but clean. A fire crackled in the hearth. She sat on the edge of the cot, her bones aching, her heart thudding. He brought her a bowl of stew and a tin cup of water, then sat across the room, watching her quietly. "You can sleep safe here," he said. Noelle stared at him. "Thank you," he nodded once. "You are welcome." She ate in silence, the weight of the road still heavy in her limbs. But for the first time in a long while, she did not feel hunted. That night, she watched the stars through the small window above her cot. Elias had gone outside to finish chores. The children were asleep. The horse was safe in the barn. Noelle curled under the quilt and pulled it to her chin. She did not know how long she would stay. But for now, she had a roof. For now, she had peace. And that was more than she had ever dared to hope for. Noelle woke to the low murmur of voices outside the cabin, the scent of damp earth and ash drifting through the open window. The morning sun had just touched the far hills, throwing long shadows across the hard-packed yard. She sat up slowly, blanket falling from her shoulders, and listened. Elias's voice, calm and measured, carried through the slats. "Fence lines down again. Elk must have come through with the storm last night." Sadie's reply was sharp with purpose. "I'll check the south run when we're done with the chickens." Noelle swung her legs over the side of the cot. The quilt had been folded neatly at the foot of her bed, and someone had left a clean shirt and cotton skirt draped over the bench by the wall. She touched the fabric, coarse but whole. She hadn't worn anything that wasn't patched or stolen in over a year. She stepped outside barefoot, the morning chill biting at her ankles. Sadie was elbow-deep in feed, her braids tucked under a blue kerchief. She didn't look up. Elias was by the barn, setting a post into the ground. He glanced up when he saw her, then nodded once. "Coffee's on the stove." "There's bread, too." "I can help," Noelle said, her voice husky with sleep. He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "You don't owe me work." "I'm not offering to pay you back," she said, stepping closer. "I just don't like standing still." That earned a faint flicker in his eyes, not amusement, exactly, but something quieter, understanding, maybe. "Then I'll show you where the creek fence broke. It's a long walk." "I've got boots," she said, and turned back inside. They didn't speak much on the trail. The land rose and fell in soft undulations, the grass high from spring rain. Elias moved with easy rhythm, the kind that came from years of walking fence lines and watching the sky. When they reached the damage, she knelt beside him without needing instruction. The post had been shoved sideways, the barbed wire slack and tangled with brush. She held it steady while he hammered the anchor back into the earth. "You said someone helped you once," she said after a while, not looking at him. He secured the final wire before answering. "My father was killed outside Fort Laramie when I was 16. I had no kin left but my cousin Ruth. She took me in, gave me a roof, gave me work. Nothing fancy, but it kept me breathing." Noelle glanced at him. "She the one who passed?" Elias nodded. "Winter took her fast. Fever burned her up in 3 days." Noelle looked back at the fence. "You ever think of leaving?" "Sometimes," he said. "But the land doesn't ask for much, just that you don't lie to it." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They walked back in silence. The sun was higher now, warming her shoulders, and she found herself breathing easier than she had in days. That evening, while Elias was out tending to the livestock and Silas dozed on a straw pallet in the corner, Sadie pulled a flat tin from beneath the hearth stones. Noelle raised an eyebrow as the girl opened it and pulled out a piece of folded paper. "What's that?" Sadie glanced at her, then held it out. "It's Ruth's list. She wrote down all the things we needed to remember. Elias keeps it hidden, but I still look when I want to feel like she's here." Noelle unfolded the paper. The handwriting was careful, looped and faded at the corners. It wasn't a list of chores, it was more like a ledger of kindness. "Give thanks before the first frost. Don't speak harshly near the river. Teach them to grow things, and if a stranger comes with eyes like winter, give them bread, not questions. Sadie's voice was low. I think she meant people like you. Noelle folded the paper and handed it back. Her throat felt tight. I'm not used to being looked at like I'm worth helping, Sadie shrugged. Neither was Elias, but Ruth saw what was underneath. The next day, Noelle rose before dawn. She slipped out to the barn quietly, hoping to check the injured mare. The swelling had gone down, and the animal stood easier now, though she still favored her right foreleg. She heard the barn door creak behind her, and Elias's footsteps followed. She's mending, he said. Noelle nodded. Another few days and she'll be ready to travel. Elias leaned against the stall rail. You planning to keep going? I was, she said. I'm not sure now. He studied her a moment. You don't have to decide yet. She met his gaze for the first time that morning. You always this patient? No, he said. But I've learned not to rush people who have been pushed too hard. They stood there a while longer, not speaking. Just the sound of the horse shifting, the wind brushing through the hay loft. That night she didn't dream of blood or running. She dreamt of fence lines and riverbanks, of a warm cabin filled with the smell of stew and the sound of children laughing. And when she woke with the first light, she didn't think of leaving, not yet. Noelle stood behind the garden fence, sleeves rolled to her elbows, dirt lining the creases of her palms. Sadie was kneeling beside the raised bed, pushing onion bulbs into the soil with the quiet competence of someone who'd learned by doing, not listening. The sun edged higher, warming the tops of their shoulders, and the scent of damp loam clung to the morning air. I've only ever seen food come from a barrel or someone's hand, Noelle said, brushing hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. Sadie didn't look up. Things taste different when you've pulled them out of the ground yourself. Noelle crouched to follow her lead, fingers finding the shape of the earth, pressing the bulb down firm. You think Elias let me plant something of my own? He ain't said no to you yet, Sadie said. You notice that? Noelle paused, her hand resting on the turned soil. Inside the cabin, Silas's laughter cut through the stillness. Elias had taken a rare half-day and was showing the boy how to mend a boot sole, something he'd outgrown weeks ago but insisted on keeping. The sound of Elias's low voice and Silas's delighted interruptions settled somewhere deep in Noelle's chest. Later, after the sun dipped low and the air cooled, Elias came out to the porch with a tin cup in one hand and a folded scrap of paper in the other. He handed her the paper without speaking, then sat across from her on the steps. She unfolded it and scanned the words, her brow furrowing. It's a contract, she said. For work, he nodded. You've been pulling your weight, but I figured you might feel better if it was official. Nobody can say you're freeloading, not that I'd let him. Noelle read the lines again. Her name was written in his careful hand. You trust me enough to put this in ink. I trust what I've seen, Elias said. And I don't believe a person should be chained to who they were born to. Only to what they choose. She folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket. I'll sign it when I've earned it. You already have, he said, then looked out over the pasture. I was thinking of putting in another corral, if you're staying, that is. She didn't answer right away. The wind stirred the grass beyond the yard and a hawk wheeled high above the ridge. I don't know what staying looks like, she said finally. Looks like showing up every morning, Elias replied. Looks like planting something you want to see grow. She glanced at him, the porch light catching the edge of his jaw, the faint lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when they first met. You always this sure of people? No, he said. But I reckon I'm sure enough of you. The next day, Noelle rode with him to the far end of the property, where the fence followed the creek's bend and the cottonwoods grew thick. It was land she hadn't seen yet, quieter than the rest, with the sound of water moving slow over stone. He dismounted and tied the reins to a low limb. I bring the kids fishing here sometimes. Ruth used to say this spot kept her from going mad. Noelle stepped down, brushing dust from her skirt. It's peaceful. Elias walked to where a flat rock jutted over the creek bank and sat, elbows on his knees. You ever think about what you'd build if you had the chance? She hesitated, then joined him. A room with a door that locks, a roof that doesn't leak. A place no one can take from me, he nodded. That's a start. They watched the water in silence. The wind moved through the trees, not sharp like the plains wind, but soft, like it respected the hush between them. I was going to head south, she said after a while, after the horse healed. Arizona Territory, maybe, somewhere dry. You still might, Elias said. But you don't have to decide today. She turned to him. You ever want more than this? I used to, he said. Now I just want to keep what's worth keeping. The late sun caught in his hair, glinting copper where he'd gone lighter from the heat. His face held a kind of quiet that didn't need filling. Noelle reached for his hand without thinking. His fingers curled around hers, warm and steady. They didn't speak again, not for a long while. But when they rode back that evening, she didn't look behind her once. The wind had shifted by early August, carrying the dry scent of sage and the faint tang of charred wood from somewhere far west. Noelle stood at the edge of the newly fenced corral, fingers curled around the top rail, watching Elias work a young roan gelding in slow, deliberate circles. Dust rose around his boots. The horse tossed its head once, then settled, responding to the quiet rhythm of Elias's voice and the sure length of the lead rope. She knew now how he earned an animal's trust, never through force, just steadiness. It reminded her of how he'd handled her when she first arrived. No pressure, no sharp edges, just space to breathe. That, more than anything, had kept her from riding south. Sadie emerged from the root cellar with a burlap sack slung over her shoulder, cheeks flushed. We've got 2 rows of potatoes going soft. If they don't get cooked this week, they'll turn. We'll boil what we can, Noelle said. Maybe mash some for the chickens. Sadie set the sack near the porch. Or trade what's still firm with the McLeans. They've got vinegar and lamp oil. Mama used to say vinegar'll keep a soft potato honest. Noelle lifted her eyebrows. That a fact? Sadie looked pleased. It's what she said. Inside, Sila's was bent over a scrap of wood, carving lines into it with a penknife Elias had given him last winter. Noelle stepped quietly around him, careful not to interrupt the boy's focus. She'd learned early that he hated being watched while he worked. After dinner, when the children had gone to bed and the cabin had gone quiet, Elias stayed on the porch. Noelle joined him, bringing 2 mugs of boiled chicory. The crickets had started up in the grass and the moon hung low behind a veil of cloud. He took the cup without a word, nodding his thanks. They sat in silence, the kind that wasn't heavy but didn't need filling. I thought about something today, Noelle said after a while, watching the faint glow of the lantern through the cabin window. When I was little, my father used to say the only thing you can count on is a loaded gun and your own 2 legs. Never believed in staying in one place long. Elias's voice was quiet. He'd teach you to shoot, she nodded once. Before I could read, he sipped his drink, then set the cup down beside his boot. Well, if you ever want to learn to mend a saddle or read a weather shift by the trees, I can show you that too. She smiled faintly. You offering to unteach everything I know? No, he said, just offering to add to it. They sat for a while longer. Then, as the wind pushed a fresh gust through the cottonwoods, Noelle leaned back against the porch post and turned her face toward the sky. You think I'll ever stop flinching when I hear a man raise his voice? Elias didn't hesitate. Yes, not because the past changes, but because you'll learn it doesn't reach you here. She was quiet a long time. I never planned on a future, she said. Only ever thought about the next day. He looked over at her, not smiling, not pressing. You don't have to plan one. You just have to start living like it's possible. A long silence passed between them, then she tilted her head slightly toward him. Would it be strange, she asked, if I started building a place of my own, maybe a room off the barn, just to see if I can? He didn't answer right away. Then, I've got cedar planks left from the north wall, and spare nails if you don't mind them bent. She let out a breath that felt like something being released from her ribs. I'd like that. Elias stood and held out a hand. She took it, letting him pull her up. They didn't let go. Inside, the fire had burned low. The air smelled of tobacco and warm pine. She didn't say goodnight. He didn't either when she lay down later, the paper contract still tucked in the drawer near her cot. She didn't dream of escape routes or cold camps. She dreamt of cedar walls. Of things that could be built and might last. The first frost set in early that year, leaving a thin silver crust along the fence posts and turning the grass brittle before the sun had fully risen. Noelle rubbed her palms together, breath clouding in the chill, as she stood beside the half-framed walls of the small structure she'd begun building near the barn. The cedar planks Elias had set aside were nearly gone, and her hands ached from days of hammering, planing, measuring. Elias emerged from the shed carrying a strip of canvas and a tin of boiled linseed oil. He handed her the tin without a word. She dipped a rag in and began to oil the corner joints of the doorframe, her movements practiced now. "I saw a buck this morning," he said, leaning against the post beside her. "Down by the salt lick. Broad chest, clean antlers. Sadie's been saying if we're going to salt meat, we'd best do it before the ground turns too hard." Noelle nodded, wiping sweat from her brow with her forearm. "I can go with you, I know how to track, and I've got a steady shot." He studied her face. "I believe you, but I think it would mean something to Silas if I took him for the first time." Noelle lowered the rag. "You think he's ready?" "I think he needs to know I trust him to be," Elias said. She nodded once, then looked back toward the cabin. "He's come a long way, so have you." Noelle focused on the wood grain beneath her hands. "When I first got here, I didn't believe I'd stay past the week." "I knew you would," he said. "You didn't know anything about me." "I knew your eyes weren't looking for trouble, just somewhere to land." She didn't reply. Her hands stilled on the frame. That evening, while Elias and Silas made ready to leave at dawn, Noelle sat at the kitchen table, mending the hem of Sadie's winter dress. The girl sat across from her, grinding dried yarrow leaves with a pestle and mixing them into small cloth pouches. "Ruth used to keep these in our boots," Sadie said. "Said it kept the toes from freezing." Noelle threaded her needle carefully. "Think she'd be proud of how you've kept things together?" Sadie didn't look up. "I think she'd be surprised I haven't run off yet." Noelle gave a quiet laugh. "I think she'd be glad you stayed." Sadie finally looked at her. "You're not going, are you?" Noelle met the girl's gaze. "No. Not anymore." The next morning, Elias and Silas left before first light. Noelle stood by the fence, watching their figures disappear into the trees, then turned back toward the cabin. There was bread to bake, feed to measure, and the last of the carrots to pull from the garden before the frost hardened them into stone. That night, they returned with the buck slung over the horse's back. Silas's cheeks were red with cold and pride. Elias wore that quiet, settled look he always had when things had gone right. They dressed the animal together by lantern light, the air thick with blood and steam. Noelle worked beside Elias without needing instruction, hands sure, eyes steady. Later, when the meat was hung and the salt packed, Elias lingered in the barn while she wiped her hands clean. "I've been thinking about the room you're building," he said, voice low in the warm dark. She looked at him, brows raised. "You could finish it and live there," he said. Or he hesitated, shifting his weight. "Or you could stay in the cabin, stay with me." Her fingers curled around the cloth in her hand. "You don't have to decide now," he added. "I already did," she said. "When I laid the first board," he stepped closer. She didn't move away. "I didn't think I'd ever want to belong somewhere," she said, eyes not leaving his. "But every morning I wake up here, I find I do." He reached for her hand. She let him take it. "I want us to build something together," he said, "not just walls. A life." She stepped closer, the space between them falling away. "I want that too." When he kissed her, it was slow and sure, the way he spoke and moved and lived. Her hands came to rest against his chest, steadying herself against the sudden, quiet certainty of him. Of this. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, just after the last of the meat was cured and the ground had frozen firm. Sadie sewed Noelle's dress from a bolt of muslin Ruth had tucked away for years. Silas built a wooden box for the rings, carved with a pine tree on one side and a rising sun on the other. They married under the cottonwoods by the creek, with only the children as witnesses and the wind carrying their vows into the branches. That winter, the cabin walls held warm. Noelle added shelves to the kitchen and stitched new curtains from old feed sacks. Elias built a writing desk for her in the corner, though she didn't yet know what she'd write. In spring, they planted onions, cabbage, and turnips. Noelle added chamomile and mint in a small plot behind the barn. The mare gave birth to a foal with a white star on its brow, and Sadie named it Maple. Silas said he wanted to be a smith when he was grown, and Elias promised to take him to Laramie come fall to see the forge there. One night, as the wind moved soft through the window and the lantern burned low, Noelle lay beside Elias, her hand resting over his heart. "You ever wonder what Ruth would say if she saw us now?" she asked. Elias looked over at her, eyes quiet and warm. "I think she'd say we made a good place out of what we had, and that's enough." Noelle smiled, pressing closer. "It is, and it was. Their life was not grand, but it was honest. Built with calloused hands and quiet hours, with patience and trust and the decision each day to choose one another again. They grew old on that land, raising more than crops. They raised a family, a home, a kind of peace neither had known before. And in all the years that followed, through every storm and every harvest, they never once looked back.